Hey guys, welcome back to your algebra class. Today we're going to find roots using the quadratic formula again, and we're going to start off by writing down the steps that we're going to take, and then also writing down the quadratic formula itself. So here are the steps. So step 1, you have to make sure that your equation is set equal to 0. Oftentimes it is, but if it's not, make sure that you rearrange things in the equation so that it is set equal to 0. Step 2 is to find a, b, and c so that you can plug those values into the formula. And remember, a, b, and c come from the equation a x squared plus bx plus c, where you're only focusing on the number, the coefficient that is in front of the variable x. So a is always the number that's in front of x squared, b is always the number that is in front of x, and c is always the number at the end that is not attached to any variable. Step 3 is to plug the values that you got for a, b, and c into the quadratic formula. And if you don't have it memorized yet, that's okay. We're going to write it down now. So the quadratic formula always starts with x equals, and then you've got a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2 times a. Okay, so that is the quadratic formula. Now technically you don't have to have it memorized. It will be given to you on any quiz, test, or regents, but it's something that you're going to use so often that naturally you should memorize it anyways. Step 4 is to find the discriminant. Now this is a new vocabulary word, but the discriminant is the number inside the radical. So it's not the actual radical, it's what's inside of it. So this is where you would type into your calculator b squared minus 4ac, whatever those numbers are, hit enter to figure out what is that number that exists inside of that radical, otherwise known as the discriminant. Step 5 is to simplify the radical. So if that discriminant, if that number inside the radical was a perfect square, then in the next step you would take the square root of that and you would end up with a nice integer answer. But if it's not a perfect square, then that's when you have to simplify it with finding what's the greatest perfect square that goes into that number and doing that to simplify it all the way. And the last step, step 6, is to just simplify your fraction as much as you can, where your answer is either in simplest radical form, or if it's a nice answer, simplify it all the way down till that nice answer. Okay, so those are our steps that we can use in the future. So make sure that you keep this note sheet somewhere that you can find it again, because it will be helpful whenever you're finding roots or solving something with the quadratic formula. Okay, first example. We've got 2x squared plus 4x plus 8 equals 24. Now, if we look back at the other page where we listed the steps, the first step is to make sure that the equation is set equal to 0, which right now it's not. So what we're going to do to make sure that this is set equal to 0 is we are going to subtract the 24 so that we can move it on to the same side as everything else, and we'll end up with 2x squared plus 4x minus 16 equals 0. So now step 1 is done. Step 2 is we have to figure out what are the a, b, and c values of this new equation. So we'll write those off to the side. And what you have to remember is a is always the number in front of x squared. So our a is going to be 2. B is always the number that's in front of x, so that's going to be 4. And c is always the number at the end that doesn't have any letter attached to it, so that's going to be negative 16. Okay, now we need to plug those values into the formula. So the formula always starts with x equals. Then we have a negative b. Now our b value is 4. And then we've got plus or minus the square root. Remember that square root sign, otherwise known as the radical, has to be really big in the beginning to fit all of the numbers inside. And inside we have, in parentheses, our b value, which is 4, that needs to be squared, minus 4 times our a value and c value. So our a value, we said, was 2. Our c value was negative 16. And this whole thing turns into a fraction, all divided by 2 times our a value, which we said was 2. Okay, so that is step 3, plugging the values into the formula. Step 4 says find the discriminant, which again is the number that is inside of the radical. So, how I like to do it is I write everything down that is not inside the radical, okay, and then I type into my calculator parentheses 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 16, and I should get 144. Now, in the next step, where it says to simplify the radical in step 5, what you should know is that, this is off to the side just to show you, if you took the square root of 144, hopefully you remember that 144 is a perfect square, and the square root of that would be 12. So, notice there is no radical with that 12. It disappears because it's a perfect square. So in the next step, we're going to end up with negative 4 plus or minus 12, all divided by 4. And now we can simplify this. So, I'm going to have to break it up into 2 parts. And we're going to get 2 different answers because of this plus or minus here. So, one answer will be involving the plus. So we've got negative 4 plus 12 divided by 4. And the other will be dealing with the fact that x could equal negative 4 minus 12, all divided by 4. Now there's a couple ways that you can simplify this. You can divide each thing by 4 first, or you can work with the numerator first and then divide it by 4. I like to work with the numerator first, so I would do negative 4 plus 12, right, and that would give me 8. And then I could take 8 and divide it by 4 and get one of my answers is x equals 2. Working with the other side, negative 4 minus 12 would give me negative 16, and negative 16 divided by 4 would give me an answer of x equals negative 4. So my 2 roots are x equals 2 and x equals negative 4. Okay, example 2. We've got 2x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. If we look back at our steps again, the first step says to set the equation equal to 0. Well, luckily this one is already set equal to 0, so step 1 is done. Then we're going to find a, b, and c. So, let's see, we can find a, b, and I think I can fit it, c. A is always the number that's in front of x squared, which in this case, again, is 2. B is always the number in front of x, which in this case is 2. And C is always the number at the end that's not attached to any variable, so this C value would be -1. So that is step 2 to find A, B, and C. Then we are going to plug these into the quadratic formula, and I'm going to write it over here just so we have it to look at. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so starting it off with x equals, and then we have -b, so we're going to do -2 plus or minus. We've got one big radical symbol. Then we're going to do, in parentheses, our b value, which is 2, that needs to be squared, minus 4, and then times our a value, which is 2, times our c value, which is -1. All divided by, make sure you make your fraction bar big enough to fit the entire numerator, 2 times our a value, which is 2. Okay. Step 3 is done. Step 3 again was plug values into the formula. On to step 4, find the discriminant, the number that's inside the radical. So, remember, always write everything down that is on the outside of the radical and simplify it up. So the denominator, 2 times 2, it's going to be 4. And to find the discriminant, you're going to type this into your calculator, unless you can do it in your head. In parentheses 2 squared minus 4 times 2 times -1. When you type all of that in, you should get an answer of 12 inside of the radical. Now, in step 5, where it says to simplify the radical, off to the side, you might want to break down how you can break down radical 12, because 12 is not a perfect square, but there is a perfect square that goes into 12. So if you list all of its factors, right, 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4, you'll notice that of those numbers, the largest perfect square in this list is 4. The square root of 4 is 2, and then we just bring down the radical 3 because we can't simplify that any further. And this is what we need to substitute in for radical 12. That's how we're going to simplify it. So in the next step, we have x equals -2 plus or minus 2 radical 3 all over 4. Now technically we could simplify this in one more step, because if we look at step 6 of our notes, it says to simplify the fraction. So we could divide both of these terms by 4. Okay? If we divide -2 by 4, we're going to get negative 1/2. Or if you don't like fractions, you can do negative 0.5. Personally, I like fractions, so I'm going to write it as negative 1/2. And then we've got the plus or minus symbol. Now, when you divide 2 radical 3 by 4, only the 2 and the 4 can divide because the radical 3 is like its own separate entity. That can only divide with other radicals. So 2 divided by 4 is 1/2, and then we still have the radical 3. Okay? And if you don't like writing it like 2 separate fractions, you could write it as one big fraction, x equals negative 1 plus or minus radical 3 all over 2. You don't have to put the 1 in front of the radical 3, but you can. Okay? So that would be your answer. Now, oftentimes, they ask, like on the Regents, to round to the nearest whatever. So in this next one, we're going to round the answer that we just got to the nearest 100th, just to work on our rounding skills. Okay? So I'm going to write down the answers that we would have had on the page before, right? So we had, one answer was negative 1 plus radical 3 all over 2, or the other answer was negative 1 minus radical 3 all over 2. Now, if you were to type this into your graphing calculator, make sure that you use the fraction bar by hitting Control Divide so that you can get the fraction and type this in appropriately. And when you do that, the one where you are adding negative 1 plus radical 3 divided by 2, you should get an answer of, to the nearest 100th, 0.37. So that's one answer. And the other answer, when you are subtracting negative 1 minus radical 3, all divided by 2, to the nearest 100th, we should get negative 1.37. So those are our two answers to finish off question 2. And that also concludes the notes. So hopefully this makes sense. If not, let me know. Contact me and I can try to do another video or something to explain.